For the first time in 2 centuries, the center of gravity for global wealth is silently shifting away from the Alps. The reversal is not marked by the smoke of a sudden collapse, but by a quiet mathematical reality. The hollowing out of an institution the modern world had agreed was permanent. Between 2010 and 2023, the number of banks licensed to operate in Switzerland fell from 312 to fewer than 250, a structural erasure of nearly 25% of the country's financial architecture in little over a decade. For generations, Switzerland operated not just as a sovereign state, but as the world's premier financial fortress. It was a system protected by explicit design, absolute banking secrecy codified in 1934, an immortal currency backed by gold reserves longer than any peer, and a doctrine of absolute political neutrality that survived 2 world wars. By 2007, this tiny republic, roughly the size of the American state of Maryland, held between $6 and $8 trillion in offshore private wealth. It was a staggering concentration. Nearly 1/3 of all international offshore capital on Earth hosted in a single jurisdiction. The polished marble facades of Zurich's Paradeplatz and the manicured estates lining the northern shore of Lake Geneva are amain exactly as they were. Yet their underlying utility has evaporated. In the ultra-high net worth real estate corridors of Geneva, properties are no longer clearing the market with the discrete speed of the past 2 decades. They sit listed for months. The change is verified not by public panic, but by the negative space left behind, the absence of the generational offshore wealth managers, the private banking clients, and the family dynasties who once viewed Swiss custody as a foundational necessity. The unwinding began with a fundamental rupture in 2008, when the United States Department of Justice dismantled the first pillar of the empire. Confronted with aggressive federal investigations into tax evasion, Switzerland's largest financial institution, UBS, was forced to pay a $780 million penalty. Far more consequential than the capital flight was the legal precedent. Washington compelled the Swiss state to surrender the names of thousands of American account holders. The myth of absolute secrecy was broken by the raw leverage of dollar clearing access. If a Swiss institution wished to remain connected to the global financial plumbing, it had to comply with external surveillance. The regulatory dominoes fell in rapid succession over the next decade. The introduction of the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act in 2014 effectively transformed global banking into an extension of the internal revenue system of the United States. This was followed in 2017 by the OECD's Common Reporting Standard, which mandated the automatic exchange of financial data across more than 100 nations. The traditional Swiss value proposition, anonymity guaranteed by state law, was dismantled brick by brick under international pressure. To survive, the Swiss establishment pivoted to what internal strategists termed the quality argument. The pitch changed from privacy to unparalleled institutional stability and risk management. For a decade, the narrative held until a single 72-hour window in March 2023 destroyed the second pillar. The sudden collapse and state-engineered forced takeover of Credit Suisse, a 167-year-old institution managing $1.5 trillion in client assets, exposed severe systemic risk management failures that the regulatory apparatus had repeatedly declared contained. The emergency consolidation into a single massive entity, UBS, bypassed standard shareholder votes and permanently altered the perception of Swiss financial permanence simultaneously. The third and final pillar, operational neutrality, was compromised by geopolitical realities. In February 2022, under immense international pressure following the invasion of Ukraine, Switzerland aligned its policy with Western sanctions, freezing an estimated $6 to $8 billion in Russian assets. For wealth holdings originating in the Gulf, South Asia, and the broader non-Western world, the calculation changed instantly. The assumption that Alpine custody was entirely insulated from great power conflict was replaced by a visible risk parameter. The neutrality premium was gone. The data reveals that the capital leaving the Alpine Republic has not dissolved, it has relocated. While Swiss assets under management stagnated and contracted in real terms against global inflation between 2022 and 2023, Singapore's private banking assets under management expanded dramatically, surpassing $3.5 trillion. Wealth is migrating to jurisdictions that offer the contemporary equivalents of what Zurich provided in the late 20th century. Localized legal sophistication, proximity to expanding capital markets, and a position outside the direct line of friction in Western regulatory disputes. The vaults beneath Zurich are not empty, and the Swiss franc remains a formidable safe haven asset. Yet, the unique conditions that made Switzerland an irreplaceable monopoly for global wealth have dissolved into history. The empire is transitioning from an unassailable financial fortress into merely a highly competent, conventional, regional banking center. The hollowing out is complete, only the polished facade remains. Why did a system designed to last centuries erode so rapidly from within? The answer lies not in the failure of its execution, but in the structural transformation of the global order that created it. But the macro data only tells part of the story. The truest evidence of this structural reversal is found in the physical reality of the spaces left behind. To observe the hollowing of the Swiss model, one must look closely at the micro-indicators that official reports scrub of human context. Walk down Geneva's Rue du Rhône or Zurich's Talstrasse on a Friday afternoon, and the silence is sensory. The high-end restaurants that once required weeks of advance booking from private equity partners and asset managers now sit half-empty, their pristine white tablecloths serving as monuments to an era of intense, face-to-face deal-making that has evaporated. The physical infrastructure of Swiss private wealth was entirely built around the concept of physical proximity and high-friction discretion. A relationship manager did not merely manage a portfolio. They managed an ecosystem of trusts, real estate holdings, and multi-generational family dynamics. In the canton of Geneva, regional labor data indicates a steady year-over-year contraction in secondary financial service employment. The independent wealth advisors, compliance lawyers, boutique family office staff who populated the periphery of the major banking institutions. This is a quiet exodus. Between 2018 and 2025, the volume of corporate office space dedicated to independent asset management in central Geneva declined markedly, replaced not by new financial players, but by generic corporate entities or left vacant behind lease for sublet signs. To understand the mechanics of this shift, consider the regional breakdown of asset migration. Historically, the Swiss system relied on predictable geographic inflows. Western European capital formed the baseline. Latin American and Middle Eastern wealth provided the growth engines in the mid to late 20th century, and post-Soviet and emerging Asian capital drove the peak expansion of the early 2000s. Today, each of these corridors is experiencing an unprecedented structural blockage. The Middle Eastern petrodollar pipeline offers a precise case study in alternative routing. Following the 2022 asset freezes in Western Europe, sovereign wealth funds and ultra-high net worth individuals from the Gulf Cooperation Council began systematically re-evaluating their European sovereign risk exposure. Instead of transferring capital to Zurich, wealth originates and remains within domestic financial ecosystems like the Dubai International Financial Center, or migrates directly to Singapore. The choice is driven by a stark architectural reality. Contemporary wealth no longer values alpine isolation over digital agility and explicit geopolitical alignment. When a major Gulf family office shifts its multi-billion-dollar custody account from a legacy Swiss institution to an Asian hub, it does not do so because the Swiss banker lacks competence. It does so because the legal jurisdiction itself has been exposed as politically vulnerable. The internal reorganization of the remaining Swiss institutions confirms the industry's own pessimistic forecasts. Following the state-enforced merger of Credit Suisse into UBS, the resulting banking behemoth began a massive consolidation process designed to strip duplicate infrastructure and eliminate costs. The fallout has severely impacted the domestic labor market. Industry insiders estimate that the total workforce across the combined entity's investment and wealth management arms is slated for structural reductions that run far deeper than initial public guidance suggested. In Zurich, the systemic contraction has triggered an unprecedented surplus of highly specialized, mid to senior compliance and relationship professionals. Individuals whose specific expertise is deeply tied to Swiss regulatory frameworks and who are finding that their skill sets are no longer scalable in a domestic market that is structurally shrinking. Why is this internal contraction so exceptionally pronounced now? The answer lies in a major structural distortion within Swiss trust law and corporate governance. For decades, the Swiss financial sector lobbied aggressively to maintain the integrity of its traditional trust structures, which allowed for complex layers of beneficial ownership. However, Under pressure from the Financial Action Task Force and European Union regulatory bodies, Switzerland was forced to implement more stringent beneficial ownership registries. The revised laws stripped away the final layers of domestic legal exceptionalism that separated Swiss wealth management from its neighbors in Luxembourg or Liechtenstein. Once the regulatory burdens of operating in Switzerland matched or exceeded those of the Eurozone, the Swiss premium, the justification for higher management fees, concepts the loss of this premium is visibly altering the industry-level dynamics within the country's smaller private banking tiers, while the massive consolidated entity of UBS can leverage its global scale to absorb the immense compliance costs of the modern regulatory era. The traditional engine of Swiss exceptionalism, the mid-sized private banks managing between 10 billion and 50 billion Swiss francs, is being systematically choked out. These institutions cannot afford the specialized legal battalions required to navigate the overlapping surveillance mandates of the US, the EU, and international tax authorities. As a consequence, the sector is experiencing a wave of defensive consolidations and quiet liquidations. These are not bankruptcies characterized by dramatic headlines. They are orderly, private transactions where a legacy name simply vanishes from the building directory, its client book absorbed by a larger competitor, and its staff quietly made redundant. The vacuum created by this decline is most visible when contrasted with the aggressive expansion of Singapore's financial ecosystem. The city-state has deliberately constructed a regulatory mirror image of what Switzerland once was, modified for the 21st century. Through the implementation of the Variable Capital Companies framework, Singapore created a highly flexible, legally sound structure specifically tailored for family offices and alternative investment managers. The numbers tell a story of deliberate displacement. The number of single-family offices operating in Singapore surged from a mere handful in 2018 to over 1,400 by recent estimates. This capital is not new wealth generated overnight. It represents a profound, structural reallocation of existing global wealth that has looked at the changing legal topography of Western Europe and chosen to alter its geography permanently. The sensory details of this transition are recorded in the registries of commercial aviation and corporate hospitality. For decades, the peak of the Swiss wealth management calendar was marked by a predictable influx of international private flights into Zurich and Geneva during corporate earnings cycles and luxury industry events. Those flight frequencies have adjusted downward, stabilized at a lower equilibrium that reflects a detached, digitized relationship between the global investor and the Swiss state. The wealth is still managed, the portfolio still execute trades, but the operational center of gravity, the place where decisions are made, where capital is deployed into new ventures, and where the elite of global commerce meet, has moved onward. What remains in the wake of this structural shift is a landscape defined by an uneasy realization among the local financial elite. The institutional trust that took 7 centuries to build was not an immutable law of nature. It was a historical variable tied to a specific global order that has ceased to exist. The state can no longer protect the capital it hosts from the geopolitical ambitions of external superpowers, and the banks can no longer offer a unique sanctuary that cannot be duplicated elsewhere for a fraction of the cost. The facade remains flawless, the mountains are unchanged, and the institutional precision is still executed with flawless discipline, yet the vital spark that made the system invincible has departed yet. The most surprising layer of this unwinding is still hidden beneath the surface of the domestic economy, where the crisis is beginning to affect things far more fundamental than private bank balances. Behind these statistics are real lives being reshaped by the quiet architecture of institutional retreat. Now, the narrative of structural decline is frequently told through macro charts and institutional balances, but its truest velocity is registered in the domestic habits of the people who assumed the system was immortal. For generations, a career in Swiss private banking was not merely a job. It was an intergenerational inheritance of status, stability, and societal prestige. To be a private banquier in Geneva or Zurich was to occupy a position of absolute certainty, a secular priesthood within an economic order that seemed insulated from the chaotic business cycles of the outside world. That certainty has dissolved. Observe the early morning commuters stepping off the regional trains at Zurich Sellnau station, a short distance from the sleek corporate offices that replaced the old stock exchange. the atmosphere is heavy with a specific, unspoken anxiety. These are the mid-level compliance officers, the back-office operators, the portfolio analysts, and the legal specialists who form the human machinery of the financial sector. Unlike the high-profile executives whose exits are cushioned by multi-million franc severance packages, these professionals are facing a market that no longer requires their numbers. When Credit Suisse was absorbed, it did not just collapse a corporate hierarchy, it triggered a cascading labor surplus that has overwhelmed the domestic job market. The sensory markers of this middle-class contraction are visible throughout the residential suburbs of Küsnacht and Meilen along the Gold Coast of Lake Zurich. These communities, historically defined by their low tax rates and affluent, tranquil stability, are witnessing a subtle change in consumer behavior. Local high-end car dealerships report an uncharacteristic accumulation of late-model luxury vehicles on their lots, as leased vehicles are quietly surrendered. The private international schools that cater to the children of the financial elite have begun noting a shift in enrollment metrics, with corporate-sponsored tuition packages being replaced by local public school enrollments as families adjust to structural salary reductions or prolonged unemployment. There is no open distress, no visible poverty, there is simply the slow, methodical lowering of expectations among a class of people who had built their lives on the assumption of permanent prosperity. The erosion extends far beyond the banking offices into the broader Swiss service economy that evolved over 2 centuries to cater to the financial apparatus. Consider the specialized craftsmanship guilds, the boutique printers who produced bespoke, security-grade physical bond certificates and corporate ledgers, the luxury hospitality providers, and the security firms specializing in high-value transit. Geneva, a third-generation bespoke bookbinder, whose family business had bound confidential client dossiers and private ledgers for the city's elite private banks since the 1920s, recently closed its doors. The digital transition had already weakened the business, but the sudden evaporation of the small, discreet, private banking houses that valued these physical touchstones of prestige was the final blow. The meticulous, handcrafted leather volumes have been replaced by encrypted cloud servers based in Dublin or Singapore, leaving a legacy of specialized human skill with nowhere to go. Why is this human cost so difficult for the domestic society to absorb? The answer is rooted in a systemic societal distortion. Switzerland's entire socio-economic contract is fundamentally calibrated to a high-margin financial surplus. The Swiss state, its high wages, its immaculate public infrastructure, and its generous social safety nets were all indirectly subsidized by the immense profitability of its wealth management monopoly. When that monopoly shrinks to a competitive, conventional banking model, the margins contract. Consequently, the state faces an unfamiliar fiscal reality. For the first time in modern memory, cantonal governments are navigating difficult budgetary debates regarding the long-term funding of infrastructure projects and public services that were once financed effortlessly by corporate tax receipts from banking giants. The psychological impact on the national identity is perhaps the most profound transformation of all. For 700 years, the Swiss identity was constructed around the concept of the Willensnation, a nation bound together not by shared language or ethnicity, but by a collective will to remain independent, neutral, and meticulously organized. The financial fortress was the economic manifestation of that ideology. It allowed Switzerland to remain separate from the European project while simultaneously dominating its financial flows. To watch this force be systematically dismantled by foreign regulators and geopolitical forces is to experience a collective crisis of sovereignty. The realization that the Swiss state could not protect its own foundational institutions from the extraterrestrial jurisdiction of Washington or Brussels has left a deep scar on the national psyche. This sense of loss is captured in the physical transformation of the banking districts themselves. In Zurich's Paradeplatz, the historical headquarters of Credit Suisse, the massive neoclassical Liefels building stands as a monument to an erased history. The interior spaces that once echoed with the quiet conversations of global industrialists and sovereign wealth managers are being adapted for luxury retail and generic corporate offices. The grand banking halls, with their high ceilings and polished granite pillars designed to project absolute permanence, feel increasingly like museums dedicated to an extinct civilization. The mahogany desks have been cleared, the physical archive digitized or shredded, and the silence that fills the rooms is no longer the silence of wealth management discretion, but the silence of an empty stage after the actors have departed. Wealth has not disappeared from the world, it has simply evolved past the need for the specific geography of the Alps. The modern global economy runs on digital velocity, explicit geopolitical alignment, and dynamic capital deployment, realities that are fundamentally incompatible with the static, secretive, physically isolated model that built the Swiss financial empire. The institutions that survived the transition will continue to operate, to manage billions, and to project an image of unassailable prestige, but they will do so as participants in a global system whose rules are written elsewhere. The narrative of Switzerland as an untouchable financial fortress has reached its natural conclusion. The great Alpine Republic did not fall to foreign armies, nor did it collapse under the weight of an internal revolution. It simply succumbed to the quiet, inexorable laws of historical obsolescence, its pillars removed one by one until the magnificent structure became a hollow shell. As the evening light fades over the silver expanse of Lake Geneva, illuminating the quiet terraces of mansions waiting for a past that will not return, the truth of the ledger becomes absolute. The system that the world had decided was permanent has become a memory, a beautifully preserved, perfectly polished monument to an era when money had a sanctuary